Welcome to Designing for Virtual Reality and Augmented Reality. My name is Darrien Staton, and I'm currently a lead UI UX designer at CrossComm, which is a web app and immersive app development agency in downtown Durham. And today I'm going to share with you some of the things I've learned while working here. Now, what once seemed light years away has been dramatically sped up by the pandemic. We are now living in a world where people share virtual spaces and participate in events that once took place in the physical world. And the thing is, with great technology comes great responsibility. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the challenges of immersive design and how we can all navigate them as designers and developers. So on today's agenda, we're going to go over what is virtual reality and augmented reality and its current impact. I'm going to talk about best practices in general for immersive design that applies to both augmented reality and virtual reality. And then I'm going to break it apart and give you specific tips and suggestions for virtual reality and then a few for augmented reality. But before I get started, I want to know, just by a show of hands, how many people own a VR headset or have used virtual reality before? Oh, wow. Okay. How many of you have used augmented reality? Okay, a little less. Awesome. Well, it sounds like we already have a few power users and a few users in the room, but I would like to just start by getting a general baseline and talk about the differences between virtual reality and augmented reality. See, virtual reality, the goal of virtual reality is to replace the environment that you're in, where augmented reality is more about enhancing the real world. So I think a better way to look at it is that in virtual reality, you want to make the user feel like they're no longer in the real world. In augmented reality, all you're doing is looking through a window and adding virtual elements on top of it. As time goes on, I believe the lines between virtual reality and augmented reality will start to blur. However, currently, virtual reality is experienced through headsets. So some are tethered, like the PlayStation VR, which a lot of people are looking forward to, and then some are standalone, like the Meta Quest, formerly known as the Oculus Quest. Now, augmented reality, although it can be experienced through headsets, a lot of that is still a little bit of ways away, and a lot of it is very expensive right now. So a lot of consumer augmented reality is really limited to like phones, laptops, glasses, and cameras and things like that. And it's mostly because it's accessible. Now, thanks to companies like Meta, Google, and Microsoft, consumer level AR and VR are becoming more affordable than ever before. And it's even predicted AR and VR markets are predicted to reach over $400 billion by 2030. Even large companies like Walmart are starting to invest into augmented reality, and they're now experimenting with experiences where they allow women to try on clothes before even purchasing them. And there are a lot more other opportunities. VR and AR are starting to move beyond the gaming industry and seep into other places like healthcare and education. We're seeing things like virtual shopping, virtual changing rooms, 3D tours. I don't know how many people during the pandemic went to try to like rent properties or buy houses, but it was really hard because you weren't able to see it, right? So 3D tours became a great tool for people to see their homes before purchasing it. Now, I know it's not the same as the real thing, but it's still better than nothing. And I believe this is just the beginning. With so many applications and ways of interacting with immersive technology, I believe it's very important that we start focusing on user experience and building best practices that we can use in immersive design to help create these experiences. At CrossComm, I've had the opportunity to work on a variety of immersive projects, and through a lot of trial and a lot of error and a lot of research, we have created best practices or suggestions that we believe can help create win-win solutions for your clients. And if you were to look up right now, go on YouTube, how to design for virtual reality, you're going to find a lot of information, a medium in different places, but it's all over the place. It's not in one single area. And I've done a lot of research and learned a lot from people and my coworkers at my company who work on immersive teams. So today, I would like to share with you what I've learned. When designing for augmented reality and virtual reality, it's very important that we all pay attention to the real world and establish UI patterns we already have. So, has anyone in this room ever heard of affordances and signifiers? Okay, we got like 2, maybe 3 strong. Well, those who have and have not, there's a guy named Don Norman, and he's really famous in the UX design industry, but in the industrial design industry. But in his book, he coined the term affordances and signifiers. And I'm going to give a little bit of spoiler alert, but he talks about how affordances are clues that an object has that tells you how to interact with it. So, for example, in the book, he used a door. And I'm going to use a door as an example because I think it's a great example. When you go to a door, there's a handle on it. And that handle itself is an affordance because it's informing the user or telling the user that it can be open. This object can be open. Now, a signifier helps indicate where and how people should interact with those affordances. So if we go back to the door, and let's say you have a sign over it that says pull or push. Now, when the user goes to open that door, they understand which direction they should be opening it. And that's what a signifier is. It helps understand how to use that affordance. Now, affordances and signifiers together help communicate to the user how we should be interacting with experiences. The great news is none of us have to reinvent the wheel. UX designers, industrial designers, construction people, and a lot of people all over the world have already done all of the hard work for us. All we have to do is borrow as much as possible and just study real-world behaviors and UI patterns. So, if you look at this example that I have here on the screen, this is a UI or a virtual experience that we've created at CrossComm for one of our clients. And in this case, when you walk up in this virtual space to this thermostat, it's a thermostat. And we've all seen a thermostat before. It kind of looks like the Nest and things like that. But when you walk up to it, you see that a hand appears. Now, what have we seen this before? If you think about web development, we have things like this. When you hover over things, you might see a hand appear. You see things highlight. Well, we're doing the same thing here. All we did was borrow from established practices we've already know of in web development, mobile development, and just moved it over to the virtual space. So we're going to go back to the thermostat. You see that a hand appears. And then there's also this green halo that forms around the thermostat, telling the user, hey, this can be interacted with, and not only can you interact with it, but it can be turned. So the user goes and grabs it, and then they start turning. Now, this is something very specific to virtual reality, but in the controllers, and you see it in like Xboxes and PlayStation and things like that, there's this thing called haptic feedback. And a lot of us are familiar with that, but in layman's terms, it's just basically the vibrations that you can feel in the controller that help add to the immersion. So as the user turns this thermostat, they can feel the clicks, each click as they turn it. All these things together help make the user experience way more intuitive. However, affordances can only get you halfway there. This is where accessibility comes into play. Just because someone understands how they should use your product doesn't mean they can perform those actions. You want to make sure you are creating experiences that are accessible to everyone. So in general, you should provide spatial audio cues to help navigate virtual environments, meaning things that are close up should sound close up, and things that are far away should sound far away. Now, this sounds easy, but what it does is it helps people understand where they are in your environment. Another thing is color choice and contrast ratios. Now, this is something we've seen everywhere. If everyone understands accessibility standards, and you hear it all the time, we always talk about contrast. Well, you're not getting away from it. The same thing applies to virtual reality. And I think it's even more important because not only is it has virtual elements, but it's also mimicking the real world. And we know that people have vision impairments and different things like that. So you want to make sure that you're creating things like text and stuff that are readable from all different angles. You also want to provide options for closed captioning. Now, I am one of those people who watch all my movies and TV shows with closed captioning on. So I actually enjoy it in virtual reality as well, especially if you have a lot of narrated experiences. And I really highly recommend it because you don't know where people are. They might be in an environment where they can't have their audio on their headset very loud, so they still need a way to watch or learn from your experience. So you just want to have things like that. And then be aware of arm fatigue. Now, I work out a lot myself, but if I can't do this all day, you can't just keep your hands in front of you, right? And then if you add the idea that people will have controllers and different things in their hands, or if they're doing augmented reality, they may have a device like a phone or a tablet. All that can start the way. So a good rule of thumb is you want to keep I would say things that have a lot of hand movement no longer than 25 to 30 minutes. That way people are not experiencing arm fatigue. Then, provide alternate ways for users to experience and interact with your app. Now, I asked earlier how many people own the VR headset, so I'm assuming a lot of people have used it before and understand there are things like standing versus sitting, right? You can do apps or experiences where it involves movement. You can walk around the stage. Or I might be isolated to a seat sitting. And it's very important that you have those things, especially if someone is wheelchair bound or something like that. But there are also other solutions. You have things like voice commands and gaze selection. Now, I don't know if any of you remember, but when VR was really first starting, you had a lot of mobile VR. We all had like Google things or cardboard where we were sliding our phones inside of there. Where early on, gaze selection was a major way for navigating through experiences. So just because we've moved on from it doesn't mean that you can't use it. You don't know, just depending on your research and who your audience is, it may be needed to use these things. So just make sure you keep them in your back pocket and make sure you have other alternatives for people to experience your experience. And then height calibration. Now, this is a non-negotiable, especially within virtual reality. You want to make sure that that is properly calibrated to the height of the person experiencing it. So I like to use the example of a bar. If all you are in a virtual space right now and you're walking up to a bar, well, I'm very short, I'm about 5'5", right? Now imagine someone is 7'3" next to me. We want to make sure we have the same experience. So I don't want to be looking up at the bar like that, wondering why I can't grab anything. You don't want someone who's 7'3" looking really low trying to grab items. So you want to make sure, no matter how tall you are, or whether you're sitting or in a wheelchair, that your experience calibrates to their height. And then lastly, this is something you will hear me say in a variety of ways throughout the presentation, and this is really important to me, and that is do not clutter the UI. Now, if that sounds like a lot, that's because it is. There's a lot to consider when you're designing for immersive spaces. And this is why I believe you should play and test as much as possible. Playing is a part of the process. When you're designing 2D elements, especially for people like me who are UX designers, you're using things like Figma, Illustrator, Photoshop, or even if you're just sketching or drawing out your ideas, you already got a picture of what that looks like, especially if, say, you're designing a poster or something for an app. You already kind of get an idea of what it may look like because it's in a 2D space. Well, you want to do the same thing with immersive elements. You want to see immersive elements in immersive spaces. And there's a ton of new software on the market that can help you craft and design immersive experiences. And the good news is they don't all involve code. Now, a lot of you are developers in the room, so there are ones that you probably heard of like Unity and Unreal. But there are AR creation tools like Roar and Adobe Euro that just allow you to get your feet wet and create AR. And then there's AR and VR prototyping tools like Tavori and ShapesXR. Now, I highly recommend everyone in the room, especially if you own an Oculus, to check out ShapesXR. It's a great prototyping tool, and even if you don't want to commit anything to learning Unity or Unreal yet, it just gives you an idea how maybe your design or how to approach something in the VR space. It's a great tool for prototyping, and you can just figure things out. I use it myself sometimes when I just want to say, hey, how will this look in there? I have developers that I work with who can do rapid prototyping. So I really don't have to, but it just helps me get an understanding when I'm designing for these spaces. And then lastly, like I talk about, the big dogs, I like to call them, is Unity and Unreal. So these are tools where even if right now as developers you don't want to commit the time to learn it, because it involves C# and things like that, you can still use it to create UI assets, right? It's come a long way, especially in Unreal Engine. There's a lot of drag and drop elements and things like that. And even myself, I've taken the time as a designer to actually learn Unity. And it's become handy because when the developers are really busy or things like that, I can hop in and create these assets that can later use to put into the virtual environments. Now, we talked a lot about best practices for immersive design in general, but now I want to get into important factors to consider when you're designing for virtual reality. One small but minor things to consider is hitboxes. Now, it's really important in VR to make sure that you have enough space and that your elements are large enough so that users don't accidentally press or select the wrong thing. So this is a minor example, but you have two hands here, and you see that one hand can clearly press the cancel or the save button. That's because the buttons are properly sized, the text is readable, and there's enough space around it. But if you look to the other example, the hand is pressing the cancel and save button. So this is what we would say is a bad user experience. The buttons are too small, the text is too small, and there's not enough space. Now you're wondering why this is important. This sounds very simple. Well, the thing is, when we go back to what I was saying, play and test as much as possible, because when you're designing or thinking of these things, we're thinking of it from a 2D perspective, right? So until you get in the VR space, you're not going to understand sizing. Things that you're designing maybe in Figma or just sketching, things like that, will be really small. And in a virtual space, it's going to need to be a lot larger than you think it's going to be. So when you're creating these experiences, you want to make sure there's enough room for users to select and properly hit items. Now, unlike owls, we can only turn our head 30 degrees in any direction without feeling discomfort, especially when sitting. A user's mobility is greatly diminished. When you are creating these VR experiences, it's important that your UI elements appear within a user's field of vision. Even if you're creating full 360 environments, you should take into consideration where a user is looking. Now, there's an added element onto that. You want to keep in mind that a user can only see things that are 0.5 meters to 20 meters out in virtual space. So, meaning anything too close, a user can become cross-eyed, can be really hard to see. Like if you had a dashboard right here, you're not going to be able to see the elements on the far ends, which is why you see a lot of screens are curved within VR space. And then things that are 20 meters out will start to become blurry within someone's vision. So you want all your information exists in a space what people call the golden zone. So the space in between 0.5 meters and 20 meters is called the golden zone. And then I'm going to break it down a little more. Around the 0.5 meters, this is where you would most likely want all your interactable items to be. So this would be your dashboard, this would be your menus, this may be things they're swiping and grabbing. And it's very important in VR, if something is in reach of someone, make sure it's interactable, that they can grab it, they can turn around. Because what can be very frustrating and break the immersion of someone in virtual reality is they're standing here and they go to grab this cup, and you can't move it, you can't grab it, because it's natural nature for people to grab things. So that is what's going to happen around that 0.5 meters. In between, around the middle is where you're going to want the bulk of your experience to happen. These are things you're visualizing, you're seeing. This may be animations and things that are happening. And then around 20 meters, this is where your background elements will be. And it's very important because that helps create a sense of depth and give you that 3D feel and that sense of immersion. Now, we talked about field of vision, and we all understand now that, within that 30-degree window, we all can see things right there. And then we understand within that field of vision, you have distance. You have things that are close to you at 0.5 meters, and you have things all the way up to 20 meters away. Well, a big part of this is movement. Now you can move within that space, right, into those distances, and your field of vision changes. Things that were far away are now close to you. So movement is a big part of VR, and personally is one of my favorite parts. But you want to be careful when you're designing what most people call locomotion. And there are a few things you want to consider. First, you want to keep things, the speed of things consistent and limit spinning and constant rotation. Those two things together are a huge recipe for what we call motion sickness. Now, all those who said earlier that they've used VR before, I'm pretty sure at one point you got very nauseous, you might have got motion sick, especially if you move too fast. And a lot of that has to do with the speed in which you're moving. So you just want to be careful and make sure you limit that. Another thing is some things should be static. Too many objects can be disoriented. So I want everyone to pretend that we're in this hallway right here and that there are images hanging on the wall. Now, if I was walking or we were walking down that hallway, we would expect as we walk past those images on the wall that are hanging, they would stay there. We would be able to walk past and see them like, oh, okay, that is cool. Now, imagine you're walking down the hallway, and as you're walking, the floor is moving with you. The pictures on the wall are moving with you. All that can make you very disoriented, and to be honest, can make you very sick. So you just want to make sure that, like we said earlier, you borrow from real-world behaviors, and make sure you don't have too many things moving, and that things that should be static are static. And then audio should match the virtual environment and your position within it. Now, a few minutes ago, we talked about spatial audio. And this is why that's important, especially when it comes to movement, because it helps user understand how to navigate and move through your space. So we're going to go back to this hallway again. But now imagine that there's a fan at the end of the hallway. As we move closer towards that fan, we would all expect that it would get louder. We would hear more of the fan. And now, say we are moving back or moving away from it, we would hope that it would dissipate. All this helps users understand when they're in a space where they are and where they're moving to. So if they move farther away, they understand, hey, I'm no longer near this area. And if they move closer, because they can hear the fan and it's louder, they understand they've made progress. They have moved closer towards it. And then lastly, this is something that a lot of people don't talk about or pay a lot of attention to, but vignetting the size or adding motion blur to your movement. Now, there's lots of ways to move in VR, and people are still experimenting. But right now, teleporting is really big, or dashing, or doing things like that. And what you don't want to happen is you don't want to be jerked from one place to another, or simultaneously appear in another place, because you can create what is a whiplash effect. All right, and it can, once again, give motion sickness and make you very disoriented. So by vignetting or smoothing the transition from moving from one space to another, you can help limit a lot of that and get rid of motion sickness. Now, augmented reality is my favorite thing to talk about due to all the potential applications like glasses and contact lenses. However, today I'm going to focus on consumer level AR, which is mostly limited to phones, tablets, laptops, and devices like that. When you're designing for augmented reality, there's really two things you need to remember or pay attention to. That is world space and screen UI. Now, world space UI are things that are integrated into the real world. So in this case, that would be the desk that this person is moving and placing within the environment. Thanks, IKEA. And then screen UI are elements that are locked onto the screen, and usually these help you interact with world space UI elements. So that would be the green button that you see appear at the bottom and the icons surrounding it. Now, just like in traditional mobile design, onboarding is very, very important. AR is still pretty new to a lot of people, and you cannot assume that they will know how to navigate your experience. So for when you're designing for onboarding, you should include tutorials and onboarding flows. And I would say you should even separate onboarding flows into bite-sized chunks so that you don't overwhelm the user. Now, I personally believe I would go a step further, especially if you have complex UIs where they're doing a lot of placement or new features that they never experienced before. I highly recommend that you break it up into steps. So, for instance, if you're going to have someone place an item in the augmented reality space, you should say, hey, this is how you place the item, and then actually have them do it. And then if you're going to have them move, understand how to move around and move the foam or whatever they're doing. That could be the next step, but then have them do it. By breaking it up into steps, it makes it easier for them to consume and move along, instead of having a bunch of information to learn and then expect the user just to know how to do it. And then next, use iconography whenever possible. Icons are going to be your best friend, just because you're working with limited space, and because it's going to be layered onto your virtual environment when people are looking around, it has to be easy to recognize, it has to be quick to see, and having too many words will make the user experience very hard. So use icons whenever possible. And then lastly, utilize animation and encourage and explain movement. This is augmented reality. That's what makes it fun, right? We want to be able to move around, we want to see, we want to explore. So you want to make sure that all your animations and things that are happening within that space are encouraging that movement. So if you look at this example that Google Maps created, there's a fox there. It's like a little fun fox that help you navigate. They're your little tour guide, and they move along. And then there's also world space icons in the background. You see those giant arrows, they're blinking and they're animating and moving the user towards that direction. And then layered on top, like we talked about, you have those screen UI elements that are locked onto the screen. And in this case, they're given directions, or you're able to get speaker directions and things like that. Now, your device that you have or that you're using for augmented reality is a window into the real world. Augmented reality and the physical world are interconnected. The user experience and immersion can be different based on the distances and the objects being viewed within the space. So there are a few spaces that we have. We have intimate space. These are things that would normally occur right in front of you. So it might be like your Instagram filters, your Snapchat filters, and things closely related in front of you. Then you have personal space. So if you're sitting in your office, that may be your desk. Or if you're sitting on your couch, that could be your coffee table. These are the items where if you ever use augmented reality, you start placing things right in front of you and interacting with it. And then you have social space. Now, this is where more people come into play. You might have 1, 2, 3, 4 more people, but this is usually about 12 feet out, and it could be your whole living room. It could be a lobby you're sitting in, or things that other people can interact with you. And then public space. And I have to say, this is just anything beyond that. And in public space, that's where cars, transit, big buildings, and a lot more people are going to come into play. And because of that, in AR, a user's physical safety can become a huge issue. You don't want users walking into objects, and worse, getting hit by cars. So, I have a few safety tips that I put together. 1, do not block user sight. We talked about earlier about not cluttering the UI. Well, now you know why. This is very important, especially in AR, because too many things on the screen can be a safety hazard. And then transparency is your friend. We talked about when you're creating items for AR, use icons whenever possible. Well, this is where that comes in handy. Transparent text can be very hard to read, but icons you can do a lot more with. So you can make them bigger, you can see through them and things like that. So that's why you want to use iconography whenever possible, because you want to try to use transparency as much as possible so you're not blocking a user's sight. And then explain how much space is needed for experience. We talked about onboarding flows and tutorials and things like that. And this is where that comes into space. This is a good place to do that, because you don't know where a person may be, and you need to understand the safety conditions that are needed for using your experience. You don't want to startle the person because your experience needs to be very used in a big space, and then they look up and they're kind of thrown off guard. So you just want to be careful and make sure you're explaining how much space is needed for your experience. Too many elements can be distracting. Same thing that applied in virtual reality, too many things happening. You don't want to do it in augmented reality. But I think it's even worse because it becomes a safety concern, it can clog the screen, and can be very distracting to the user. And then don't ever make a user move backwards. The whole part of augmented reality is that it's enhancing the real world. So the idea is you need to be able to see where you're going. You need to see the elements that are happening. And unfortunately, none of us can see behind us. At least not yet. I don't have that superpower yet. So you want to make sure that you're not walking backwards and putting people in harm's way. And then lastly, if you remember anything from these safety tips, remember, AR is an extension, it is not a replacement. So it's not virtual reality. You never want to replace everything that's happening within their field of vision, because once again, they won't be able to see what they're doing, and they could walk into a table because they think it's a tree, and because you replaced the whole environment. So you just want to be careful with that, and make sure you remember that AR is an extension, not a replacement. Now, in the future, I believe we will need designers that are not just web or mobile designers, but people who are able to navigate from one medium to another. The protocols that we adapt and establish today will set the tone for the future. So in this example here, I mocked up a nice little fun weather app in Figma. So this doesn't exist or anything like that. But I just wanted to show how easy that AR will be integrated into our future technologies, and even VR for that matter. But in this case, you have a nice little weather app, and then when you press AR mode, what did we talk about? We talked about safety in tutorials. So in this case, I have a safety and health protocol image that pops up on the screen. Now, for this app, it's not that complicated. It's just a filter, something fun. So I don't need to have step-by-step guides and things like that. But because it is AR and there are safety concerns involved with space and walking around movement, you still want to have something that says, hey, be careful where you're walking, where you're looking while using the experience. So I have that pop up, and then the user press I understand. And then I have a fun little snowman animation that appears dancing around, and you can see how many inches of snow are falling as they look around. So this is something simple, but it shows how easy AR and things like that will start to become part of our everyday items that we already have within mobile and web development. And if you've heard Meta's keynote speech lately, they have a lot of ideas for incorporating VR and AR to the masses. So you will eventually get to a point where we have people in VR then in meeting spaces, right? And they're adding their friends from phones and laptops, and they're watching. They're not even in VR. So AR and VR and all these things will start to be blended into other spaces. So key takeaways. Borrow from the real world and establish UX practices as much as possible. Be aware of where a user is looking within a space and where they may be in. Remember, the size and distance of your elements can limit or increase immersion. And lastly, but not least, and this is probably the last time you hear me say that, do not clutter the UI. Now, if you would like to learn more about unique challenges of designing for immersive technology, check out our podcast called Speaking from User Experience. This is something that we created at CrossComm, thanks to Shane, Philippe, Don, and all the people that's in the audience and at the booths outside. We like to talk a lot, and as you notice, I like to talk a lot. So I highly recommend that you check it out, and we have other talks. And today, we actually just put out a talk about designing for XR, mixed reality, and things like that, or as we talked about here, augmented reality and virtual reality. So if you would like a longer version of what I've just presented, feel free to check out our podcast. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions.